They say hindsight is 20/20, and looking back now, I can't believe how blind I was to all the signs. But I guess that's what happens when you trust someone completely. I never thought I'd be writing one of these posts, but here I am, and it's been quite a journey. First, some background. I, 34MM, was married to Sarah, 32F, for 8 years. We met in college, built our careers together, and I genuinely thought we had it all. I'm a team lead at a tech company. She's in marketing. We bought our dream house 2 years ago, had plans for kids next year, and everything seemed perfect. I was proud of our relationship, how we supported each other's careers, how we still had date nights every week. I thought we were different from other couples who grew apart. The first changes were so subtle, I dismissed them. Sarah started staying late at work more often. But hey, she was pushing for a promotion, right? She became more protective of her phone, but doesn't everyone value their privacy? She started going to the gym more, and I was happy she was taking care of herself. There were new clothes, new perfumes, more business dinners than usual. But when you see someone every day, these small changes don't set off alarm bells. They should have. The funny thing about trust is that it makes you rationalize everything. When she started taking more business trips with her new senior manager, James, 38M, I actually felt proud that she was getting more responsibilities. When she'd come home late from these trips, slightly disheveled but energetic, I assumed it was the excitement of successful business meetings. God, I was such an idiot. I remember our last normal weekend together. We had brunch, watched a movie, and made plans for our upcoming anniversary. She kissed me goodbye that Sunday night before another business trip, and I told her to knock them dead in the presentation she was supposedly preparing with James. She smiled. That smile haunts me now, and said she would. I didn't know then that this normal, perfect weekend would be the last piece of my old life. I didn't know that in less than 24 hours, I would stumble upon something that would shatter this perfect reality and set me on a path I never expected to take. But that's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with warning signs and red flags. Or maybe it does, and we're just too trusting to see them. This is the story of how I discovered my wife's affair and how I methodically dismantled the lives of everyone involved. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't served hot or cold. It's served meticulously planned. The discovery happened on a Monday. Isn't it ironic how the worst day of your life can start so normally? I was working from home that day, neck deep in code reviews, when Sarah called saying she'd accidentally sent an important work document to my email instead of her work email. She needed me to forward it ASAP for her big presentation. She sounded flustered, which should have been my first clue. Sarah's never flustered about work. I opened my email, and there it was. But she'd sent several files, not just one. Being the methodical person I am, I opened each to make sure I was forwarding the right one. The third file wasn't a presentation. It was an email chain that had been accidentally attached between her and James. My world collapsed in the time it took to read those messages. Last night was amazing. Can't wait for next week's business trip. Miss your touch already. My husband doesn't suspect anything. We need to be careful with the hotel receipts this time. 8 years of marriage, and my hands had never shaken like they did reading those messages. The earliest emails went back 7 months. 7 fucking months of lies, of me being the stupid, trusting husband. Every business trip, every late night at the office, every work dinner, it all clicked into place with sickening clarity. I must have sat there for hours, reading and rereading, documenting everything. The tech lead in me took over. I created backups, took screenshots, started a spreadsheet of dates and times. My brain went into analytical mode, while my heart felt like it was being put through a shredder. The worst part wasn't just the physical betrayal, it was the utter contempt they showed for me in those emails. They were laughing at me, jokes about how oblivious I was, James bragging about fucking my wife in his office while I was sending her "Have a great day at work" texts. Sarah complaining about my boring predictability, the very stability she'd once said she loved about me. The bathroom tiles were cold against my knees as I threw up everything in my stomach. My hands gripped the porcelain bowl so hard they turned white. 8 years of memories flashed through my mind, each one now tainted with doubt. Every business trip, every late night, every time she was too tired. Had it all been lies? I don't know how long I sat there on the bathroom floor, but eventually something inside me shifted. The trusting, loving husband died reading those emails, and someone else took his place. Someone colder, more calculating. I splashed water on my face, straightened my clothes, and made a decision. I would not let them see me break. I forwarded the presentation she actually needed, called her back with a steady voice, and played my role perfectly. "Hope the presentation goes well, honey. Love you too." The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but they came out smooth as silk. Years of leading tech teams had taught me how to keep my voice steady under pressure. Now those skills would serve a different purpose. That evening became the first performance of my new role. When Sarah came home, I kissed her hello like normal, asked about her day like normal, watched her lie to my face like she'd been doing for 7 months. But now I saw everything with painful clarity. The slight flush when her phone buzzed, the way she angled the screen away from me, the practiced casualness when mentioning James's name. As we went through our evening routine, I studied her like a stranger. This woman who shared my bed, who wore my ring, who had vowed to love me forever. She was now my subject of observation. Every gesture, every word, every little habit, I cataloged them all with the detachment of a scientist studying a specimen. I laid in bed that night next to my wife, listening to her steady breathing, and started planning. They thought they knew me. Predictable, boring, trusting. Their biggest mistake was underestimating what that predictable, boring tech lead could do with the right motivation and resources. Because here's the thing about us tech people, we know how to gather data, how to analyze patterns, how to find vulnerabilities in systems. And marriage, I realized, was just another type of system, one that I now intended to methodically break down. Tomorrow I would begin gathering intelligence. But tonight I just lay there, letting the last remnants of my old life slip away, replaced by something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous than the trusting husband they thought they knew. The next few weeks became an exercise in meticulous intelligence gathering. My tech background became my greatest asset. I approached this like debugging a complex system, methodically identifying and documenting every vulnerability. First, I needed complete digital surveillance. I set up a home network monitoring system, nothing illegal, just carefully configured router logging. It's amazing what you can learn from metadata alone. Sarah's phone connected to office Wi-Fi locations that weren't her office. Late-night messages sent from locations that weren't where she claimed to be. Each data point went into my growing evidence file. The physical evidence came next. I installed a GPS tracker in our shared car, completely legal, as my name was on the registration. I started documenting every receipt, every credit card statement, every suspicious Uber ride. The story they told was damning. Hotel charges disguised as client meetings, dinners for two at restaurants across town, shopping trips for things I never saw her wear. I documented everything meticulously, creating a timeline of their deception. The real gold mine came from an unexpected source, social media. Not the carefully curated posts on their main profiles, but the digital breadcrumbs they left elsewhere. A mutual connections Instagram story showing them at a restaurant when Sarah was supposedly at a girls' night. James's wife's Facebook photos of family events on days he was allegedly on business trips with my wife. Each discovery was another knife in my heart, but I channeled that pain into more thorough documentation. Then there was James himself. Background checks are surprisingly thorough, when you know where to look. His company history, property records, social media, everything built a picture of a serial predator. Sarah wasn't his first affair at the company, just his most recent conquest. I found 2 previous workplace relationships that had ended mysteriously, with the women leaving the company suddenly. Each piece of information was carefully preserved and categorized. I created secure cloud backups of everything, multiple copies, encrypted, accessible only to me. Each piece of evidence was categorized, time-stamped, and cross-referenced. The tech lead in me took pride in the elegant organization of it all. The husband in me died a little more with each new discovery. The hardest part was maintaining normalcy at home. Each morning kiss goodbye, each evening conversation about our days, all while I knew where she'd really been, who she'd really been with. I learned to channel my rage into meticulous documentation. Every lie she told became another data point, each deception another piece of evidence carefully logged and categorized. During these weeks, I developed a routine. Wake up, kiss Sarah goodbye, go to work, gather evidence during lunch breaks, come home, act normal, document more after she went to bed. Rinse and repeat. Each day my evidence file grew larger and my emotional attachment grew smaller. I was becoming something different, not just a betrayed husband, but a careful investigator, building an airtight case. Some nights, lying awake beside her, I almost broke. Almost confronted her, almost screamed out all the questions burning inside me, but then I would remember their emails mocking my predictability, my trusting nature, and that rage would cool into something harder, more focused. They thought they knew me. They thought I was boring, predictable, safe. They had no idea what I was capable of when given proper motivation. But gathering intelligence was only phase 1. I needed to understand the complete picture before making my move. Because this wasn't just about exposing an affair anymore. This was about dismantling the entire system they'd built around their deception. And for that, I needed to be thorough, patient, and absolutely merciless in my attention to detail. As my investigation deepened, I expanded beyond just Sarah and James. I began mapping their entire network of deception, every accomplice, every enabler, every person who helped maintain their lies. The picture that emerged was far more extensive than I'd initially imagined. The central enabler was James's assistant, Amy. Her role in their affair made my blood boil more than most discoveries. She wasn't just passively aware, she was actively helping them coordinate their deception. I found countless emails where she arranged their business meetings, booked hotel rooms under approved corporate accounts, and crafted alibis for both of them. She took pride in it, even making jokes in emails about being their faithful guardian angel. I made special notes about Amy. Enablers like her deserved their own category of consequences. I dove deep into the company's HR policies, ethics guidelines, and corporate governance documents. Every night while Sarah slept peacefully beside me, I studied these materials like they were sacred texts. James, as a senior manager, had violated at least 15 different company policies. Sarah's position implicated her in 12 violations. Each infraction was meticulously documented, with supporting evidence carefully organized and cross-referenced. The financial angle proved particularly damning. James had been expensing their rendezvous as business meetings, a clear case of expense account fraud. Every receipt, every questionable expense, every misused company resource went into my growing file. I estimated they'd defrauded the company of over $12,000 in false expenses over 7 months. The evidence was irrefutable. Timestamps, locations, and credit card statements all told the same story. I also started investigating James's home life. His wife Rebecca's social media painted a picture that made me feel sick to my stomach. She was constantly posting about their perfect marriage, family values, and how blessed she was to have such a devoted husband. Their 2 kids featured prominently, family vacation photos, school events, Sunday dinners, all while their father was destroying another family. I found myself spending hours looking at their family photos, feeling a strange kinship with Rebecca. She, like me, was living in a carefully constructed lie. The company's annual charity gala provided a particularly surreal evening. I watched Sarah and James perform their practiced dance of professional distance. He gave a speech about corporate values and integrity, while his wife beamed proudly from the audience. Sarah sat next to me, occasionally squeezing my hand, playing the role of devoted wife. I smiled, laughed at the right moments, and played my part perfectly. Inside, I was documenting every glance, every subtle interaction between them. Their performance would have been impressive if it wasn't so sickening. Throughout all this, I maintained my routine with mechanical precision. Weekly date nights with Sarah continued. I attended family functions, smiled at company parties, and played the role of devoted husband flawlessly. Each successful deception on their part was matched by my own performance of ignorance. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had become as skilled at deception as they were, just for a very different purpose. One particularly difficult evening, we hosted a dinner party where James and Rebecca were among the guests. I watched James interact with Sarah, noting their carefully maintained distance, the way they avoided eye contact for too long, the subtle tells that were now glaringly obvious to me. I observed Rebecca's complete trust in her husband. The same trust I'd had in Sarah just months ago. The weight of what I knew, the burden of their secrets, felt almost unbearable that night. After the guests left, Sarah commented on what a lovely couple James and Rebecca were, how enviable their marriage seemed. I agreed, watching her face carefully, as I added that trust and honesty were the foundations of any strong marriage. She didn't even flinch, just smiled and kissed me goodnight. Her ability to compartmentalize would have been admirable if it wasn't so destructive. That night, as I added the evening's observations to my evidence file, I realized something important. I was no longer gathering intelligence just for my revenge. I was now driven by a broader sense of justice. Rebecca deserved to know the truth. Those previous women at the company deserved vindication. Even the company itself deserved to know about the violations of trust and policy happening under their roof. With all the evidence gathered, I began preparing for the endgame. Each step was methodically planned, every contingency considered. This wasn't just about exposing their affair, it was about orchestrating a complete, systematic dismantling of their lives, timed for maximum impact. First, I prepared separate evidence packages for different recipients. Each was carefully curated for maximum effect. For HR, a comprehensive file of policy violations, expense fraud documentation, and evidence of workplace misconduct. For the company's ethics board, detailed records of how company resources were misused, including timestamps, locations, and financial data. For James's wife, Rebecca, a carefully selected set of evidence that wasn't too crude but was absolutely undeniable. She deserved the truth, but not the most painful details. For James's boss, focus on the financial fraud and abuse of company resources. For Sarah's department head, evidence of how client meetings were fabricated and company time was misused. I consulted with a divorce attorney, carefully selecting one known for handling high-profile corporate cases discreetly. When I showed him my evidence, his eyebrows shot up. "This is remarkably thorough," he said, flipping through my documentation. "Most clients bring me suspicions. You've brought me a forensic analysis." I had him prepare all necessary paperwork, but instructed him not to file anything yet. Timing would be crucial. Financial preparation was next. I methodically separated our finances in ways that were completely legal, but would protect my interests. New accounts were created. Important documents were secured. I documented every financial move meticulously. I wanted the divorce proceedings to be as clean and quick as possible. Sarah had no idea that while she was sleeping next to me, I was systematically untangling our lives. I secured a new apartment, paid 3 months' rent in advance, and gradually began moving essential items there. Nothing noticeable, just important documents, irreplaceable family heirlooms, and key electronics. I set up a new home office there, complete with everything I'd need for the aftermath. The apartment became my command center, ready for when everything went public. The final phase of preparation involved setting up my support system. I quietly reached out to family members I could trust, preparing them for what was to come. I had careful conversations with a few close friends, laying groundwork without revealing anything specific. Each person was chosen carefully. I needed people who could keep secrets and provide support without compromising my plan. Throughout all this, I maintained my routines with Sarah. We still had dinner together, watched TV, made weekend plans. But now each interaction had a countdown attached to it. Each time she smiled at me, each kiss, goodbye, each "I love you," I mentally marked it as one of the last. It was surreal, knowing that these normal moments were the final scenes of our marriage, and I was the only one who knew it. The trigger date was set to coincide with their next planned business trip. The timing was perfect. They'd be together when it all came out, unable to coordinate their responses. Evidence packages would be delivered simultaneously to all parties. The divorce papers would be filed the same morning. Every detail was orchestrated for maximum impact. 2 days before execution, I had a moment of doubt, not about whether they deserved it. That was beyond question. I questioned whether this level of calculated revenge was changing who I was as a person. But then I remembered their emails mocking my trusting nature, their cruel jokes at my expense, the countless lies told to my face. My resolve hardened. They hadn't just betrayed my trust, they'd betrayed it while laughing at me. Now they would learn what happened when you pushed a methodical man too far. Tomorrow would be our last normal evening together. Sarah didn't know it, but her carefully constructed house of lies was about to collapse. She and James thought they were so clever, so careful. They were about to learn that they hadn't just betrayed a loving husband, they'd created an enemy who had spent months planning their downfall. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just about exposing the truth. It's about choosing the perfect moment for that truth to do maximum damage. And I was ready to deliver damage on a scale they couldn't imagine. The first moves of my plan started subtly. After weeks of gathering evidence, I needed to test the waters to see how they would react under pressure. The methodical planner in me knew that their responses would help me fine-tune my final strategy. I began by disrupting their routine in small ways. An accidental scheduling conflict here, an unexpected appearance at a work event there. Each tiny interference sent ripples through their carefully orchestrated deception. Sarah started showing signs of stress, sleeping restlessly, checking her phone more frequently, making small mistakes in her lies. The weight of maintaining my facade was starting to take its toll. Every night, lying next to her, I felt a storm of emotions threatening to break free. Rage, heartbreak, disgust, they swirled inside me like a toxic mixture. Sometimes in the dark, silent hours, I would find myself shaking with suppressed emotion, tears rolling down my face while she slept peacefully beside me. The contrast between my inner turmoil and her serene betrayal made me feel like I was losing my mind. During one particularly difficult evening, Sarah showed me photos from our wedding while planning our upcoming anniversary. "Remember how happy we were?" she asked, smiling at a picture of our first dance. I looked at her face, the face I had loved and trusted for 8 years, and felt physically ill. Here she was casually reminiscing about our wedding vows, the same vows she had been desecrating with James for months. The sheer audacity of it made my hands shake. I excused myself to the bathroom, where I had one of my increasingly frequent panic attacks. As I sat on the cold tile floor trying to control my breathing, I realized something. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was grieving. Grieving for the man I used to be, the marriage I thought I had, the future we had planned. That grief was transforming me, hardening me, pushing me toward something darker than I had ever thought myself capable of. The next day, I made my first overt move. During a company meeting, I deliberately brought up the topic of corporate ethics and expense fraud. I watched James's face carefully as I spoke about the importance of trust and accountability. For a brief moment, I saw fear flicker across his features. Sarah, sitting across the room, dropped her pen. That tiny crack in their composure felt like the first real victory. That night, alone in my secret apartment, I finally allowed myself to fully feel everything I had been suppressing. I screamed until my voice gave out, threw things, sobbed like a child. Then, exhausted and empty, I sat down at my computer and began the next phase of my plan. The raw emotional release had cleared my mind, sharpened my focus. I wasn't just planning revenge anymore. I was fighting for my own survival, my own justice. My hands were steady as I typed, my mind clear. The pain was still there, but now it fueled me rather than paralyzed me. They had created this version of me, this methodical architect of their destruction. It seemed only fair that they should meet him. My first strategic move hit harder than expected. I casually mentioned to Rebecca at a company function that I was thinking of surprising Sarah by joining her on her next business trip. "You should come too," I suggested innocently. "Make it a couple's retreat while they're not in meetings." The flash of confusion on her face told me what I needed to know. James had told her he was going alone. That single comment set off a chain reaction. Within hours, Sarah was in a barely concealed panic. "You can't come on the trip," she insisted that evening. "It's strictly business, very boring, lots of meetings." I watched her fingers nervously shredding a paper napkin as she spoke. The lies came faster now, more desperate, less polished. I could almost see the frantic texts between her and James, trying to manage this unexpected complication. The emotional toll of watching her scramble to maintain their deception was overwhelming. That night, I drove to my secret apartment and completely broke down. The realization that she would rather pile lie upon lie than confess that she was still choosing him hit me with physical force. I spent hours writing in my journal, documenting every painful detail. These weren't just therapy sessions anymore. They were evidence of the psychological trauma I was enduring. James's reaction came the next day at work. He approached my desk, all fake camaraderie and forced smiles. "Hey, about that business trip," he started. I watched him spin an elaborate tale about budget cuts and canceled meetings. His confidence was almost admirable. He'd clearly had practice lying to people's faces. I played my role perfectly, expressing just the right amount of disappointment. Inside, I was cataloging every nervous tick, every slight hesitation in his delivery. The next week brought an unexpected twist. Sarah started being more attentive at home, almost like she was trying to compensate for something. She suggested date nights, cooked my favorite meals, initiated sex for the first time in months. Each loving gesture felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I endured her touch, her kisses, all while fighting waves of nausea. The intimacy she was using to manipulate me only reinforced my determination to expose their betrayal. During one of these forced intimate moments, she whispered that she loved me. Something inside me snapped. I rushed to the bathroom and vomited, my body physically rejecting her lies. As I knelt on the cold tile floor, shaking and sweating, I heard her concerned voice through the door. The genuine worry in her tone made me laugh hysterically. How could she act so concerned while systematically destroying our marriage? That moment of breakdown led to a crucial realization. My emotional responses weren't weaknesses. They were fuel for what needed to be done. Each betrayal, each lie, each manipulative gesture was strengthening my resolve. I began documenting everything with renewed purpose, especially my psychological and emotional state. If they wanted to paint me as the villain later, I would have proof of exactly what their actions had done to me. The next phase of my plan involved subtle changes in routine. I started working late occasionally, mentioning new project deadlines. Sarah's reaction was telling. Instant relief at having some evenings free, followed by guilty overcompensation. I watched her type out messages to James when she thought I wasn't looking, probably updating their schedule of rendezvous. The irony of her using my fake work delays for her real affair wasn't lost on me. Each night, as I pretended to work late but actually sat in my secret apartment organizing evidence, I felt myself growing colder, more detached. The man who had once written love notes to Sarah was gone, replaced by someone who documented her every lie with clinical precision. I wasn't sure if this transformation was survival or surrender, growth or destruction. Perhaps it was both. As my plan progressed, I found myself becoming increasingly detached from our shared life. Family photos on the walls felt like exhibits in a museum of lies. Our bed became enemy territory, where I conducted nightly surveillance. Even our morning coffee routine turned into an exercise in studying deception. How she checked her phone while thinking I was reading the news, the slight smile when certain messages arrived. My emotional state fluctuated between extremes. Some days, watching her maintain her charade filled me with cold satisfaction, knowing what was coming. Other days, simple things would trigger overwhelming pain. Finding an old anniversary card, seeing her wedding ring catch the light, hearing her laugh at something on her phone. During one particularly dark moment, I found myself staring at our wedding album at 3 a.m., drinking whiskey and methodically documenting timestamps of her affair against our happiest photos. Rebecca, James's wife, unknowingly became my emotional anchor. I started paying more attention to her at company events, noting how her trusting nature mirrored my own former self. During one lunch break, she showed me pictures of their family vacation, proudly describing how James had planned everything. The photos were from the same week I had evidence of him and Sarah at a hotel across town. I excused myself and threw up in the office bathroom. That incident crystallized something for me. This wasn't just about my pain anymore. Rebecca's innocent trust, her complete faith in her marriage, hit too close to home. I began adjusting my evidence files, ensuring that when everything came out, she would have all the information she needed to protect herself legally and financially. She deserved better than to be blindsided like I had been. Sarah's behavior grew increasingly erratic as I continued subtly disrupting their routine. She started making small mistakes, calling me by the wrong name once, leaving her phone unlocked, getting defensive about innocent questions. I documented every slip, every inconsistency, but it was the emotional toll of maintaining her lies that really began to show. Dark circles under her eyes, nervous habits, occasional moments of inexplicable guilt where she'd become overly affectionate. During this time, I had my first consultation with a divorce attorney. As I laid out my evidence, he whistled low. "Most people bring me suspicions," he said. "You've brought me a case." But when he asked if I wanted to file immediately, I declined. The timing wasn't right yet. The look of confusion on his face almost made me laugh. He didn't understand that this wasn't just about ending a marriage anymore. The most surreal moment came during our wedding anniversary dinner. Sarah had insisted on celebrating, probably out of guilt. I sat across from her at the same restaurant where we'd had our first date, watching her raise a toast to many more years together. The sheer audacity of it should have made me angry, but instead I felt an odd sense of clarity. I recorded the entire dinner on my phone, adding it to my evidence file under premeditated deception. That night, as she slept beside me, I finished the final preparations for my plan. Everything was in place: the evidence packages, the legal documentation, the financial preparations. I looked at her sleeping form and felt nothing. The woman I had loved for 8 years was essentially gone, replaced by this stranger who wore her face and slept in our bed. The next day would be the beginning of the end, though she didn't know it yet. As I closed my laptop and slipped into bed for what would be one of our last nights together, I realized that in orchestrating their downfall, I had fundamentally changed. The trusting, loving husband was gone. What remained was someone else entirely, someone they had created through their own actions. They say living well is the best revenge. I disagree. The best revenge is served with meticulous planning, precise timing, and the complete destruction of everything they thought they could take for granted. D-Day began at exactly 9 a.m. I knew Sarah and James were at their business meeting, a hotel downtown where they'd spent countless afternoons together. I'd chosen this specific morning because their guard would be down, their phones would be on, and the maximum number of people would be at the office. Timing was everything. At 9:01, I sent the first batch of emails. The company's entire ethics board, HR department, and senior management received comprehensive evidence packages detailing the affair, the expense fraud, and every company policy violation. The documentation was meticulous: dates, times, locations, receipts, email exchanges, everything cross-referenced and time-stamped. At 9:05, I called Rebecca. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. "Rebecca, I need to talk to you. It's important. Can you meet me at Starbucks near your office?" Something in my tone must have conveyed the urgency because she agreed immediately. As I drove to meet her, I saw my phone exploding with notifications. The chaos had begun. Meeting Rebecca was the hardest part. She sat across from me, still innocent, still trusting, clutching her coffee cup. I handed her a sealed envelope. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, "but you need to know." My heart pounded as she opened it. I watched her face transition from confusion to disbelief to horror. Her hands started shaking so badly she almost dropped her coffee. "How long?" she whispered. When I told her, her face went chalk white. 7 months of lies, 7 months of family dinners and shared vacations, all while her husband was sleeping with my wife. She started crying silently, dignified, even in her devastation. I gave her the second envelope, contact information for my divorce attorney, and documentation she'd need to protect herself legally and financially. While we sat there, both our phones started blowing up. The evidence I'd sent to the company was spreading like wildfire. Sarah called me 6 times in 5 minutes. James tried 4 times. Their panic was palpable, even through the ignored calls. Rebecca's phone showed similar desperation from James. We sat in shared silence, 2 people united in our pain and betrayal. "They're at the Marriott downtown," I told her quietly. "Room 718. I debated whether to share this information, but she deserved the choice of confrontation if she wanted it. She stared at me for a long moment, then straightened her shoulders. "Take me there," she said, her voice hard with determination. "I want to see their faces." As we drove to the hotel, I felt strangely calm. Months of planning, of hiding my pain, of meticulously documenting every lie, it had all led to this moment. The weight of secrecy lifted from my shoulders with each mile. By the time we pulled into the hotel parking lot, I felt lighter than I had in months. What happened next would change all our lives forever. But in that moment, driving toward the final confrontation, I knew with absolute certainty that I had done the right thing. Sometimes the truth hurts, but lies destroy. And it was time for destruction. The elevator ride to the 7th floor was silent. Rebecca stood rigid beside me, her knuckles white around her phone, which hadn't stopped buzzing. My own phone was a symphony of notifications, Sarah's increasingly frantic messages, calls from the HR department, texts from colleagues. I'd silenced everything except emergency contacts. This moment deserved our full attention. When we reached their room, Rebecca hesitated for just a moment. I saw her twist her wedding ring, a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache. Then she raised her hand and knocked. The sounds from inside the room stopped abruptly. There was whispered conversation, hurried movement. Rebecca knocked again, harder this time. "James, housekeeping," she called out, her voice surprisingly steady. The door opened just enough to reveal James, his shirt hastily buttoned wrong. The moment he saw us, all color drained from his face. Behind him, I heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath. The room smelled of sex and panic. James tried to close the door, but Rebecca was faster, pushing past him with a strength I hadn't expected. I followed, more to witness than to participate. Sarah sat frozen on the rumpled bed, clutching a sheet to her chest, her face a mask of pure horror. Her phone lay beside her, screen still lit up with notifications from my evidence emails. The reality of their situation was just beginning to dawn on them. Their carefully constructed world of lies was collapsing in real time. 7 months, Rebecca said, her voice shaking with rage. 7 fucking months of lying to my face? Family dinners, Christmas, our anniversary. She pulled out her phone and started reading their messages aloud, her voice getting stronger with each word. James tried to interrupt, but she silenced him with a look that could have frozen hell. Sarah started crying, trying to explain, to minimize, to rationalize. I watched her with a detachment that surprised me. This woman, who I'd loved for 8 years, now seemed like a stranger, pathetic and small in her desperate attempts to control the uncontrollable. "The entire company knows," I said quietly. "Every email, every receipt, every lie. It's all been sent to HR and the ethics board." The impact of my words hit them like physical blows. James staggered back against the wall. "You can't—" "My career, the children," he stammered. Sarah turned to me, her face streaked with mascara. "You've ruined everything," she whispered. The irony of her accusation made me laugh, a sound so cold I barely recognized it as my own. "No," Rebecca cut in. "You ruined everything. Every lie, every secret meeting, every time you laughed about deceiving us. That was you ruining everything." She turned to James, pulling off her wedding ring. "The kids will know what their father really is, a liar, a cheater, a coward who destroyed 2 families for his own selfish desires." The next few minutes were chaos. Sarah trying to get to her clothes, James attempting damage control on his phone, both of them realizing the full scope of what I'd done. Their company emails were already disabled, part of standard protocol when ethics violations were reported. Their carefully crafted explanations and excuses fell apart as their phones buzzed with messages from colleagues, friends, family. I stood in the corner, documenting everything. This too would go into my evidence file, their reactions, their attempts to shift blame, their moment of realization that there was no way out. Rebecca's strength amazed me. She methodically took photos of the room, of them, of the evidence scattered around. Like me, she'd learned the value of documentation. "The divorce papers will be delivered to your office this afternoon," I told Sarah. "Don't bother coming home. The locks are changed and there's a security team waiting. Your things will be delivered to your mother's house." I'd thought saying these words would feel triumphant. Instead, I just felt tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes after months of carrying a heavy burden. As Rebecca and I left the room, the sound of their panic fading behind us, she reached for my hand. We stood in the elevator in silence, 2 strangers bonded by betrayal, both of our lives irrevocably changed. But while Sarah and James's world was ending in that hotel room, for us, it felt like a beginning. The beginning of truth, of justice, of freedom from lies. The aftermath was swift and devastating. By the time Rebecca and I returned to our respective offices, the scandal had consumed the entire company. Every computer screen showed hushed conversations. Every conference room held whispered meetings. Sarah and James's downfall was unfolding in real time, their professional reputations disintegrating as quickly as their personal lives. HR moved with surprising efficiency. By noon, both Sarah and James had been suspended pending investigation. Their company accounts were locked, their access cards deactivated, their projects reassigned. The evidence I'd provided was damning, not just the affair, but the expense fraud, the misuse of company resources, the falsified reports. They'd broken virtually every ethics policy in the handbook. I sat in my office watching the corporate machine exact its own form of justice. Emails flew back and forth between departments. The legal team was already preparing statements. The ethics board had convened an emergency meeting. My phone kept buzzing with messages from colleagues, some expressing sympathy, others sharing their own suspicions they'd had but never voiced. Around 2 p.m., Sarah's mother called me. Her voice shook with anger and disappointment, not at me, but at her daughter. "I raised her better than this," she said, crying. "Your things are safe here. I'll make sure she doesn't damage anything." The support from my mother-in-law was unexpected, but oddly comforting. Family ties, it seemed, didn't always trump morality. Rebecca texted me throughout the afternoon. James had been trying desperately to reach her, alternating between begging for forgiveness and threatening legal action. His family had gotten involved, his father calling to berate her for publicly humiliating their son. She handled it all with remarkable composure, forwarding each threat to her lawyer with clinical detachment. The company's response exceeded my expectations. By end of day, an official memo had gone out addressing the situation in professional but clear terms. Both Sarah and James were placed on indefinite unpaid leave. An audit was launched into all their expense reports and client interactions. Their indiscretions had opened a Pandora's box of corporate scrutiny. But the most satisfying moment came when my lawyer called. He'd received notice that Sarah had tried to access our joint accounts, only to find them legally frozen. Her credit cards were canceled, her access to our house denied, her belongings already boxed and moved to her mother's. The life she'd taken for granted had been dismantled in less than 8 hours. "What about the house?" Rebecca asked when we met for coffee after work. Her eyes were tired but clear. "I can't stay there anymore. Too many memories." I nodded, understanding completely. I'd already decided to sell our house, too. Some spaces become poisoned by betrayal, too toxic to reclaim. As we sat there, survivors of the same storm, I felt the full weight of the day finally hit me. My hands started shaking as I lifted my coffee cup. Rebecca reached across the table and steadied them with her own. We sat in silence, both processing the end of our old lives and the uncertain beginning of something new. "Was it worth it?" she asked finally. "The waiting, the planning, the pain of knowing for so long?" I thought about the months of silent agony, the nights of documentation, the careful orchestration of today's events. "Yes," I replied. They thought they were careful, thought they were smarter than us. They needed to learn that betrayal has consequences. It's been 3 months since the day everything came crashing down. The divorce was finalized last week. Turns out, when you have overwhelming evidence of infidelity and financial misconduct, things move surprisingly fast. Sarah didn't even contest it. Her lawyer took one look at my documentation and advised her to accept all terms. The professional fallout was even more dramatic than I'd anticipated. The company's audit revealed that James had been running this playbook for years. 3 other affairs with employees, all carefully hidden under fake business expenses. 2 of his previous victims came forward after the scandal broke, sharing their own stories of manipulation and career damage. The company's liability concerns turned their investigation into a full-scale inquisition. Both Sarah and James were fired for cause, their termination letters citing ethical violations, expense fraud, and creating a hostile work environment. The company even pursued legal action to recover fraudulent expenses. Their professional reputations were thoroughly destroyed, LinkedIn shows them both still seeking opportunities. Turns out companies aren't eager to hire executives with documented histories of workplace misconduct and financial fraud. The most surprising development was my relationship with Rebecca. Not romantic, we're both too broken for that right now, but something deeper. A shared understanding that only fellow survivors can have. We meet for coffee every week, comparing notes on divorce proceedings and healing processes. Her strength continues to amaze me. She's rebuilt her life with a grace I'm still trying to achieve. Her children are struggling with the revelation about their father, but she's handling it with remarkable wisdom. They need to learn that actions have consequences, she told me, even when those actions come from people we love. She's taken them to counseling, helping them process the destruction of their family's foundation. James's attempts to paint himself as the victim fell flat when faced with the evidence of his calculated deceptions. Looking back now, I'm struck by how thoroughly they underestimated us. They saw what they wanted to see, a trusting husband, a devoted wife, both too naive to catch on to their sophisticated deception. Their contempt for us became their weakness. They never imagined their victims would be capable of such methodical, devastating retribution. I've moved into a new apartment, started fresh. The old house sold quickly. Apparently, the real estate market doesn't care about the emotional ghosts haunting a property. I donated most of our shared belongings to charity. Some memories aren't worth keeping. Sarah tried to reach out last week. Her email was a masterpiece of self-pity, how she's lost everything, how she never meant to hurt me, how she's learned her lesson. Her new reality is apparently hitting hard. She's living with her mother, working a basic administrative job, the best she could get with her tainted reputation, and watching her former life slip away. Her corporate aspirations are dead, her professional network destroyed. James fared even worse. Rebecca's divorce terms were brutal. Her lawyer used my evidence brilliantly. He lost his house, half his pension, and his children barely speak to him. His attempts to spin the story as a moment of weakness collapsed when faced with proof of multiple affairs and years of deception. Last I heard, he'd moved to another state, trying to escape the wreckage of his life. Their enablers faced consequences too. Amy, James's assistant, was fired for her role in facilitating their deception. Several colleagues who had known about the affair and stayed silent were reprimanded. The company implemented strict new ethics policies, using their case as an example of how not to behave. My evidence file became part of their corporate training materials, anonymized, but clear in its message about integrity and consequences. The healing process has been complicated. Some days I feel proud of how I handled everything, the meticulous planning, the perfect execution, the complete dismantling of their carefully constructed lies. Other days, the weight of what I endured hits hard. My therapist says this is normal, that processing betrayal takes time. She's helping me understand that my methodical approach to revenge was actually a coping mechanism, a way to channel pain into purpose. Rebecca's been instrumental in my healing process, just as I've been in hers. We understand each other's triggers, the small moments that can bring everything rushing back. We've developed our own support system, helping each other navigate this new reality. Her kids have even started calling me Uncle, seeing me as part of their support network in dealing with their father's betrayal. The company promoted me last month. Apparently, my handling of the situation impressed senior management. They appreciated my professionalism in documenting everything properly and going through official channels. The irony isn't lost on me. My wife's betrayal inadvertently advanced my career. Looking back on everything now, I realize that their affair didn't just end my marriage, it fundamentally changed who I am. The trusting, somewhat naive man who discovered that first email no longer exists. In his place is someone more cautious, more observant, but also, surprisingly, more confident. I know now exactly what I'm capable of when pushed too far. Some friends have suggested that my revenge was too harsh, that I could have just divorced Sarah quietly and moved on. They don't understand that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. Sarah and James hadn't just cheated on their spouses. They'd systematically deceived everyone around them, stolen from their company, and laughed about it all. Their arrogance demanded a response that matched the scale of their betrayal. The hardest question my therapist asked was whether I regret any of it. The truth is, I don't. Not the months of silent gathering of evidence, not the methodical documentation, not even the public exposure. They chose to play their game, confident in their superiority, believing their victims would be too weak or too stupid to fight back. They needed to learn that actions have consequences, and some betrayals earn exactly what they deserve. Rebecca and I had dinner last night, celebrating both our divorces being finalized. We talked about how different our lives are now, how neither of us could have imagined this outcome a year ago. "You know what's strange?" she said. "I'm actually happier now, sadder, wiser, but happier." I knew exactly what she meant. There's a peculiar freedom in having your worst fears realized and surviving them. This will be my last update on this story. Sarah and James are now just cautionary tales, examples of how arrogance and betrayal can backfire spectacularly. Their perfect little affair, which they thought they managed so cleverly, destroyed their marriages, their careers, their reputations, and their futures, all because they underestimated their partners, thinking we were too trusting, too passive, too predictable to be a threat. So here's my final message to anyone going through something similar. Trust your instincts. Document everything. And remember, sometimes the quiet ones, the methodical ones, the predictable ones are the most dangerous when betrayed. Justice doesn't always arrive quickly, but with proper planning and patience, it arrives precisely when it should. Time to close this chapter and begin the next one. This time on my own terms.